Welcome back to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of StillCurtain.com. And joining me again today is Shayne Kubas, contributor for Still Curtain. Shayne, we've got a preseason game in the books, and it wasn't too bad. It was at the very, as far as preseason games go, it was quite entertaining, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, 100%. It's not quite real football yet, but we're getting closer to that. And this felt, especially when a certain person that we'll talk about later came into the game, definitely felt more like a regular season game than most preseason games do. So,
yeah, it certainly did. One that came down to the wire, too, and one that had kind of implications throughout with some potentially really key players playing late in the game, one of which being Kenny Pickett, which we'll get to in just a little bit. I want to start by talking about some recent roster moves the Steelers have made. A couple unfortunate things happen. Yeah. Anthony Miller landed on IR with a shoulder injury. Carl Joseph on IR with an ankle injury. Their seasons are believed to be done. And that's not good for two players who were firmly on the bubble, perhaps even on the inside of the roster bubble, who could have really carved out roles this year.
Absolutely. Like Anthony Miller played very well in camp up to this point. He was fighting for that, probably 6th wide receiver spot. And Carl Joseph, he's a veteran. We know what he's capable of. He's a good 3rd, 4th safety to have, and somebody who you can trust to put out there if need be. Definitely two guys who were at least in consideration for the roster that you'd rather have the option to play if possible.
Yeah, you certainly don't like to see that to anybody, even if they are players towards the bottom of the roster.
Right.
Anthony Miller did begin training camp working with the first team wide receivers, which was interesting. And it maybe showed some of the trust that Coach Tomlin had for him. And so we don't know how it would have played out. We have a better idea of how it's going to play out, specifically at the wide receiver position right now. But Anthony Miller was a guy who potentially could have fought for that 5th or 6th receiver spot if the Steelers keep another one this year. And a guy that offered maybe a little bit more on offense than someone like Gunnar Olszewski or Miles Boykin.
Right.
We shared our thoughts on the receivers before. We're going to do a roster prediction next week, which I think is going to be a lot of fun. But I think Miller is a player who at the very least, had a very solid shot at sticking around. Or if it didn't work out in Pittsburgh, I could have seen someone else maybe exploring that as an option during cut down day. So that one hurts. Carl Joseph as well. From what I had seen from training camp, it looked like Joseph was kind of getting the nod as the 2nd string strong safety over Miles Killebrew, a guy that has more experience defensively in that department. Killebrew is kind of the special teams guru there, but Joseph is a guy who really could have carved out a role, and especially if there was an injury to a safety this year. So not moves that we like to see. In addition to those two, the Steelers were forced to cut their roster like every other team down from 90 players to 85. In the process, they got rid of Doug Costin, Jake Dixon, the offensive tackle, Chris Owens, the undrafted rookie guard, and their backup punter. Any thoughts on that?
Nothing unexpected. And we kind of know that as far as punting battle, it's going to be Harvin again this year to start the year, which I'm glad about. I want to see him have a chance to kind of redeem himself. As far as the other guys, again, they were depth offensive linemen at best, not anything unexpected. And then defensive line, we know that there's only a few guys who are even consideration at this point. So probably for the best for them to kind of maybe see if they can stick somewhere else or figure out what they want to do next.
Yeah, and Doug Costin was one of those guys. He was a fun story for USFL guy, but there was just no chance of him sticking on with the depth of the defensive line. The Steelers already have a decision to make, and that's whether or not to devote a 7th roster spot to the interior defensive line, something they haven't done in 10 years since 2012. And so that player would be Montrevious Adams or Isaiah Loudermilk. We're going to touch on those guys a little bit later as well. In the process, you do the math here for roster cuts, 2 players on IR, that's 6 players. The Steelers had one more spot available, and so that they signed Bill Dunkel, former guard of the Eagles. It's kind of, I don't want to use the word camp body, but that's kind of what it feels like at this point, especially with another round of roster cuts coming right up. So do you think there's any hope for him?
I think the problem is he's pretty much purely a run first player. Like he does not really offer you much from the pass blocking standpoint. We already have guys who kind of fit that bill to a certain degree, but have better chance of becoming better pass blockers, in my opinion. He'll be nice to have just because you will be able to get some good run snaps out of him if need be, like in the preseason, if he sticks or in practice. But I don't see him doing much other than that.
Yeah, it's going to be incredibly difficult for him, especially I think John LeGlue had a good
Yes,
game in his
he
first
did a
preseason
really good
game. I
game.
think that he's solid. And so when you get a guy this late in the process who's still trying to learn the names of his teammates right now, and it might be with them a week or two. And so it kind of just seemed like a due diligence type of move. We'll see where it goes. And one other thing I want to touch on some of the roster moves, not official that I've seen yet, unless you've seen it, Shane,
I
but
haven't
Master
seen.
Teague was carted off yesterday. And so we don't know the severity of the injury. Master Teague is obviously he's the Steelers' backup running back. I thought he played pretty well in his first preseason game, averaged over 5 yards a carry. He didn't play until later in the second half, but I thought he did a pretty good job overall. Former Ohio State running back, really good athlete. This was a big blow to a guy that was having a strong camp.
Yeah, really great name as well. He's definitely going to be on
It is.
all name teams if he sticks at any point.
All name Hall of
But
Fame right there.
exactly, yeah. But I will say he did play very well. I think in his limited snaps, he showed toughness as a runner. That's what he was going to have to show to kind of stick on a roster. And it is unfortunate if he does miss a lot of time or if his season's done. So we really don't know at this point. But if he does come back before camp's over, I could see him continuing to fight for a spot.
Yeah, let's hope it's not too bad for him. For a player in his position, it's so tough because
Yeah,
a guy that was already outside of the roster bubble, you can't afford a hit like this. And so maybe and I don't want to speculate here, but if the injury is severe at all and he's not gonna be back for these next couple of preseason games, it might be one of those situations where the Steelers will try to stash him on IR maybe and try again next year in his second season. So we're wishing the best of luck for him there. All right, let's talk about the Steelers' first preseason game against the Seattle Seahawks last Saturday. A lot of interesting things to note. I went through it just recently and I did my stock report. And so we're going to kind of talk about the players that stood out in a positive light and the ones who stood out in a negative way. And so let's start with the stock rising players. And the first name that I want to point out on that list is George Pickens. Hard to be upset with his rookie debut. The 21-year-old impressed all through training camp. He comes in, has a connection, obviously, with Mitchell Trubisky and Mason Rudolph when he came in afterwards and caught all three of his catchable targets. There were two overthrows that weren't deemed catchable. Caught all three of his catchable targets for 43 yards and a touchdown. What do you think of his performance in his first game?
I just was really happy to see the things that we had seen in camp translate to the field, right? It is a preseason game. It's the first quarter mostly, second quarter a little bit, but like seeing him do it on the field against any competition other than the Steelers in camp just kind of helps you realize this is a real thing. This isn't just camp hype. And honestly, his stock might be about as high as anybody in the NFL right now. I mean, the NFL themselves tweet about him, seems like every day. Like, no one's going to be surprised by this guy going off at this point, which is a bit of a disadvantage. I'd rather him be kind of a secret weapon, but he's made it impossible to be a secret weapon. He's played about as well as you could ask a rookie at any position, let alone a receiver, come in and play.
Yeah, I know this phrase gets overused and it's so cliche at this point, but his stock literally is soaring right now. I feel like it's very safe to say that. I think that gets overused, but it really is for Pickens. The NFL Twitter account went as far as to change their profile picture to the famous picture of George Pickens watching himself in the draft. Now it's George Pickens watching himself catch a touchdown pass in the preseason game. So the NFL and the NFL media in general seems to be pretty high on Pickens.
Yes.
They probably should be from everything that we've seen so far. There's nothing to suggest otherwise. Remember, this is a guy that suffered an ACL tear last year, and it caused him to only play 4 games in his junior season at Georgia before declaring for the draft. And so had we seen him in a full season last year, the results could have been very different. I don't think we're looking at a guy that's available with the 52nd pick, and the Steelers are able to snag him right there.
No, I don't think so at all. No.
All right, let's go to my next player that stood out in a positive light, and that was Trey Norwood. I thought that Trey Norwood had a very good game on the defensive side of the ball. Second-year defensive back, was a 7th-round pick. Nothing special in terms of like size or athleticism, but man, this guy is versatile, and you can see that with where he lines up. He can play cornerback, nickel. He can play free safety, and so he just feels like he has a very good feel for the football. According to Pro Football Focus, he was targeted 4 times, did not allow a reception, and had 2 pass breakups in that game. And that's with him only playing roughly half the game. So what are your thoughts on him?
He's a guy that when you put him out there against non-starting players, especially, he flashes because of how much smarter, how much faster he is to the ball, how much easier it is for him to diagnose things than a lot of the guys he's playing against, right? Like you can tell that on an intellectual level of the game, he's at a higher level than the guys he's playing against. Now, it doesn't translate as easily when he's going against starting caliber players, but it still shows up enough that it does make him very playable despite the athleticism not really being there, like you said, the size being kind of iffy. He's one of those players that he's always in the right spot, and it allows him to kind of leverage his knowledge of the game and allow him to still be in the right place, even if he always can't run there like some other guys can. So he was very impressive. I really like to see him play well. I'd love for him to be able to be kind of that Swiss Army knife like they wanted, I think what Tomlin wanted out of him when he came out. And if he can do that, it'll be just another piece on the defense that we can throw out there to confuse teams and to mess with them.
Yeah, and usually like there's not ever a ton of hope for those guys that are drafted as late as he was, 7th round selection. But I thought that Norwood did enough to impress as a rookie. And I think that his versatility is going to be an asset. I mean, I think this is a guy that could really carve out a niche like in dime packages for the Steelers.
Yes.
You can come in, he's versatile, he can play multiple positions, and certainly just didn't disappoint in his first preseason game. I want to see if he can take that next step forward this year and really be a guy that they can go to and count on in that secondary. All right, let's talk about Mitch Trubisky. His debut with the Steelers. This is a guy, almost everybody's projecting him to be the starting quarterback of the Steelers. I think that we probably agree there as well. What did you make of his first performance? It was only a couple drives. He finished the game at 4 of 7. 9 yards an attempt, which is good, and a passing touchdown. A lot of that was some yak yards from Gunnar Olszewski there. But what did you think of his first performance?
I think the thing that stood out was his ability to throw under pressure, because one of the things that has always concerned me with Mitch is once he has to go past either his first read or just have to actually make a play outside of those first couple reads, the play tends to kind of break down for him. And he was able to go to the right place, find the right place to get with the football under pressure, especially that throw to Gunner that he stopped and ran up the sideline after he caught the ball. It was thrown right on time to where it needs to be, and he got plowed after the play. Like he got hammered, and it didn't matter. He still got the ball to the right place. And if he can do that behind the offensive line, that again, still kind of shaky from a pass protection standpoint, if he can make plays like that in the regular season and he can continue to show that, he's going to be this team's starting quarterback, obviously at least to start the year. And I think he can hang on to that job too, if he can do some of that stuff well. And the touchdown was great. Like you saw Pickens carry like 3 guys with him. Everybody's worried about him. Gunner gets open the back. He rolls out, throws a perfect ball. It was about as good of a first drive, especially, that I could have hoped for from him.
Yeah, it really was. Not much to complain about there at all. And I agree with you on your assessment of Trubisky in general. And this is a guy that I want to see be able to make some of those plays. The factor that the Steelers have going in their favor this year they didn't have over the last several years is mobility now, right? With Trubisky, and eventually when Pickett comes in, both of those guys can move. They can really get outside the pocket and extend the play. And so I'm definitely excited about that aspect of his game. I thought it was a good first performance overall. Now, we got to remember, they're not exactly playing the cream of the crop here. This is the Seattle Seahawks, and by most accounts, probably one of the least talented teams that's going to be out there in the league this year. But I do give credit where credit is due. I think that he did a good job. This is, remember, his first meaningful NFL action playing with these guys, and I don't think it was a bad performance at all. All right, let's talk about a couple of the running backs in this contest. The first is Anthony McFarland. This is a guy I've been trashed for talking in a positive light about Anthony McFarland. I know he did nothing in his first 2 years, nothing at all. But I still have some hope that this guy could be kind of that, I don't know, lightning to Najee Harris's thunder, although it's going to be 99% Najee. We know that
for sure.
But a guy that can just come in and offer a spark. I mean, he was fast, and he was a guy that I really liked his college tape too. And so I think he's finally starting to get it. I don't know if it's something that's clicking, if it took him a while to get the playbook, and part of it was injuries as well. But McFarland looked really good, I thought, in his first game, averaged 8 yards a pop, and that's not bad. He going playing with the starters there. There's some good run blocking up front, but man, he wiggled out free for a big 26-yard carry, and I thought he had a pretty good performance. So, what'd you think of his 2022 debut?
I'm just really excited to see him look healthy, because that's, as you mentioned, like, he hasn't been great when he has gotten on the field, but it's really been injuries. I think the primary problem for him is just staying on the field, getting comfortable. And it does seem like he is getting comfortable with the playbook and the fact that he's the kind of runner that as long as his vision is okay, that's what really I struggled with a little bit whenever he was first starting to get some playing time as a rookie, especially. The vision really wasn't there. The ability to break tackles wasn't really there. He was pretty much just a speed guy, right? Which that's nice to have, but it's very not very useful depending on the situation. What I saw from him in this game, one, the vision was definitely there, especially on that cutback run where he was able to get outside and make guys miss down the sideline. You talk about the speed still looks good. He still has a quickness, and he was fighting through tackles. And it isn't, again, it's not the best defense he's playing against, but he's still breaking tackles by a lot of guys who are going to be players for the Seahawks this year, going to be in the NFL. This was the best he's looked, period, since getting drafted by, I think, a pretty good margin.
Oh yeah, I would certainly agree too. And we got to be careful again, not to overhype. It is preseason, but and I think we both know that. But I think that if Anthony McFarland is a guy that ends up carving out a role for the Steelers, I think he's just going to be a guy with a niche. He's not going to be your well-rounded running back, the bruiser between the tackles, and he's really not going to be the guy that you want in pass protection situations either, because I think that he might, if he's not the worst, him and Mateo Durant, he's probably one of the worst in terms of his pass protection pickups so far of the running backs in training camp. And so that's just not going to be his forte. His niche is going to be speed, breaking off chunk plays. He's not going to do a lot of the arm tackle breaking like we saw from some of these other running backs so far. But he can chew up yards in a hurry. And even in the times, if he does go down on first contact, you could see some of those runs that are 4-6 yards. He's hitting the hole hard. He's getting positive yardage. And I thought he looked pretty impressive. So let's go to the next running back who I thought was perhaps equally as impressive. Didn't average as many yards per carry, but man, broke a lot of tackles. Didn't get the opportunity to play with a first string offensive line like McFarland did, but Jaylen Warren. And this is an undrafted rookie at Oklahoma State. We didn't give it. We kind of wrote him off like very early on. And I think that it was like Mateo Durant was the guy that was getting all the buzz because he was the 6-foot running back with 4.4 speed. And so little Jaylen Warren is 5'8" and 215 pounds. He was kind of getting overlooked, just an average athlete, Big 12 guy. But man, he has been impressive in camp, and he didn't disappoint in his first preseason action, right?
Absolutely. And he's a guy that to me right now, and this kind of is going to be something we talk about here shortly, but he's the guy that seems to be the best fit of the guys I've seen to be the direct backup to Najee, right? He's not obviously the same size as Najee, but he's the same type of runner in the sense of being very difficult to tackle. He's going to break tackles. He's not going to outrun you really at all, but he's going to make it difficult for you to get him on the ground. He was really good as a pass catcher too. He had the touchdown from Kenny. He caught 4 passes for 30 yards, I believe. Like, he made an impact in all facets of the game, and he can pass protect. I really think he can do that at the NFL level, and that allows him to be, especially if, God forbid, something happened to Najee, which would be not great for us, but he could at least do some of the things that I think Najee does very well, just not to the same level.
Yeah, ball security has been an issue with him,
Yeah,
but outside of that, man, I've been really impressed from everything else that I saw. I thought the same when I was down in Latrobe myself for a few days and watching him perform down there, and it was much of the same. Just a guy that impresses, great contact balance, runs through arm tackles, doesn't lose a lot of speed in the process, kind of like that little bowling ball mentality right there. And so definitely a player that's really fun to watch. We might have a little bit of a running back battle on our hands. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So let's talk about one more of our winners and for the stock rising, and that is Kenny Pickett. Hard to argue with the results in Kenny Pickett's debut. Completed 13 of 15 passes for under 100 yards. Did have the touchdown pass at the end. He was aided by his receiver there, but I thought it was a very good performance, a scripted one at that, but a very good performance. I think Matt Canada had him well protected as to not make any poor decisions or anything that way. And so it was a give and take there, but I really like what I saw from him. So go ahead and expand on what you thought from Pickett's first preseason game.
I think it's very interesting you talk about scripting, because I do think that there was a very purposeful way that they expected him to play, right? Because we've seen him make the spectacular throws in the run. We've seen him escape the pocket. We've seen him do all those things his last year with Pitt. It's going to be how good is he at doing the stuff that we saw him do in this game, hitting the right guy on the checkdowns, throwing the ball, right past the line of scrimmage, make sure you get those shorter passes that you can complete easily, take what the defense gives you in general. That's the stuff that I really want to see Kenny do well at early on, because that tells me that even though I do think he's already a pretty ready player overall coming in the league, if he can do those things well and you get some of this spectacular stuff with him running away from guys and throwing the ball down the field to all these receivers that he's going to have if he does play at all, that tells me that he could have a pretty decent ceiling even as a rookie if he had to come in and play. Now, I still kind of hope that the way that Trubisky's playing, that he doesn't have to play, and it's not because Trubisky's bad. It's just because they want to play him if they ever do. But this does give me hope that he could win from the structure of the offense. He doesn't have to make plays on the run constantly. He doesn't have to be just a playmaker. And that he understands if I play within myself inside the pocket more, it's going to make my effectiveness on those rollout plays and the play action stuff even more effective than it would be anyway.
Yeah, and everybody should be pleased with what they saw from him. I think that we can all agree that the arrow has been pointing up. And nobody should be dissatisfied with Canada's game plan for him either. I know the yards per attempt weren't there, just 6.3 yards an attempt. If that were a season average, that'd be very poor. That's not what we want. Like that'd be like Ben Roethlisberger, like 39-year-old Ben Roethlisberger level, which is not ideal. And so we want to see that go up. I'm looking for that to go up in the next few games. But in terms of like his debut performance, keep him protected, allow him to make some simple reads, let him get comfortable. And that's exactly what he did. And ultimately it took a forced fumble from Mark Robinson, but he was able to lead that game-winning drive. And so that's, I mean, it couldn't have worked out a whole lot better for Pickett in his debut. All right, let's shift gears. And there weren't as many notable like players who just bombed in this game.
Right.
But there were a few.
Yeah.
And sadly, my biggest one was Devin Bush. Like, I just don't know what is going on with this guy anymore. I went back and watched the All-22. I watched the game for a second time. I'm not pleased with what I've seen from him. Are you getting a different feel, or are you thinking the same, Shane?
It's just so hard to watch him and remember the way he started his career. Because even as a rookie, like obviously he was a rookie linebacker playing for the Steelers. It's hard to do that. He made his mistakes, but he flashed a ton of big playability. And then his 2020 started off really well for the first, 5 games or so before he tore his ACL. And it just seems like more so than normal now with the ACL injuries, it just seems to have affected him in such a bad way. Like he just can't. He doesn't have the same burst. He doesn't have the instincts that he showed as much anymore, which again shouldn't even be affected by the ACL really. He doesn't have the tenacity in the run game. Like he is a smaller player overall, so you have to be willing to really dive at guys and get in the action. He just doesn't do it anymore. And unless that changes, unless his mentality changes, and maybe that's the biggest thing. Maybe it is a mentality thing for him at this point. He doesn't want to be the guy that maybe gets into the rough and deals with that stuff. That has to change if he wants to be a starter on this team at all, and especially if he wants to be an effective one who gets a second contract. Things have to change very, very fast, and I just don't know if I can say that they will at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kicking myself for my evaluation of him initially.
Yeah.
Like, this is a guy I watched a lot in college. And so just the other day, I went back and I put on some of his college tape again. I'm telling you, I don't believe that he plays like the same player that we saw at Michigan, the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year. This is a guy that was flying around the field, playing 100 miles an hour, playing like his hair was on fire. He was hitting people hard, and we see like a shade of that Devin Bush right now. I don't know. I don't want to cherry pick what it is. I don't know if it's an effort issue, if he doesn't trust his knee, or if he's just a bad football player. It could be a combination of the three for all I know, but it's not good. The results that we saw were not good. It was much of the same against the Seahawks, completely washed out of a few plays, late in coverage on a few, just completely less than ideal. And they didn't do anything particularly well. I think that even Pro Football Focus in his first preseason game had him finish with like a 29 grade overall,
it was
which
ugly.
It was an ugly grade. And so, man, Steelers, they certainly have a question at linebacker. It looks like it could be rolling with a combination of Bush and Spillane. And hopefully you put those guys in the right field at the right time, or on the field at the right time. Maybe the collection of the two of them can make for one average linebacker. I think Steelers fans would accept that at this point. If
at this point,
play from them. Jack looked good. I was pleased with that. And so, but Bush, not so much. And that's going to be a huge factor on defense this year. All right, let's talk about Kendrick Green. This is a guy that he gets talked about a lot on Twitter, and he probably should. This is a guy's former 3rd-round pick. The Steelers moved his position after one season. I was not a fan of them doing that. A guy that's it stands under 6'2" and roughly 300 pounds. It's I got an issue with that. And my issue is Kendrick Green at guard goes down to the first percentile, meaning that 99% of NFL guards, according to Mock Draftable's database, that have come into the league since 1999 are larger than he is. And so when you get somebody that's that much of an outlier, like a bite-sized player in respect to the other players at his position, you kind of got to figure that things can go south. And that's what we've seen so far. And not only at practice, I feel like in the one-on-ones, he struggled against the bull rush. And then we saw much of the same against Seattle. So what were your thoughts on Green in this game?
I think that ultimately, like, Green's best chance to stick from, like you said, like a size perspective and from, finding some sort of qualities with him that makes sense is center. And he showed last year, I don't think it's going to work. And playing him at guard, there's certain things that he does well that might translate at guard, but he just doesn't, like you said, the size, the power, the base. Like he doesn't handle power well enough to play inside in general. And obviously he's way too small to play anything other than inside. So he's kind of pigeonholed into this backup-ish guard who, like, maybe he won't kill you if he's out there occasionally, but I just don't see a path to him ever being able to be a starter at guard or really center even, unless he really develops his technique at center. And they just don't have time to play around with him. Like, they need to play Dotson. Obviously, is the guy that should be playing there whenever he's healthy and good to go. But even like John LeGlue, he's a better player right now than Kendrick Green, really in every aspect. And like, that's nothing against like LeGlue, not saying he's a terrible player, but if you're a 3rd round pick last year and you're getting outplayed by him consistently 2 years now, really, if you count last year when he did play, I think they're at a point where like that experiment's pretty much over.
Yeah, I won't argue with you there. I mean, LeGlue has had a strong camp, and he was excellent in the preseason. He didn't allow pressure. His pocket was perfect. And so it's not the exact same situation. They're not Green played with the starters. LeGlue didn't. But man, the fact that we're even comparing him right now to an undrafted guy saying and confidently saying that this guy looks better than Green, it probably means that the Steelers missed on the pick. And I don't want to be too much of a Debbie Downer, but we're in year 2. This guy still looks rough. He looks like he's on roller skates and pass protection. And it's just not something that we want to deal with. And I don't think it's something that can go on too much longer. We're going to talk about Kendrick Green in the pod just a little bit later too, but let's get to the rest of the players with the stock trending down after the first preseason game. We thought Devin Bush was bad. Buddy Johnson wasn't a whole heck of a lot better, more productive on the stat sheet. So if you care about that at all, Johnson led the team in tackles, 7 solo tackles in this game. And I thought he did a few things all right. He had a couple of nice plays, but in general, I thought it was like kind of much of the same that we saw from Bush, just the guy that was just late to react to everything.
I think he was definitely more active than Bush overall. Like, he was trying more. The effort looks better. But again, he didn't get to the right spots at the right times. His athleticism is good for a linebacker in general, but it's not spectacular. So he can't really afford to be that late, as late as he was, both in coverage and trying to defend the run. Again, it just seems like everybody on this team outside of Jack and maybe Spillane in the run game occasionally, they're just late to the party to stuff. They don't diagnose things fast enough. And then once they do, they don't trigger downhill with the speed you need to if you're going to be late at all. And Bush used to be able to get away with that, I think, a little bit. But now that he doesn't have that same burst, at least that I saw early on, neither of these guys can really make those plays late like they maybe used to be able to get away with. Like, it just isn't happening right now.
Yeah, and what a great story it would have been, like, if Buddy Johnson would have been like this guy that comes in. Bush is struggling. Buddy Johnson, this 92 percentile athlete, fourth round pick. He comes in and he's the guy instead of Bush. Unfortunately, it's not looking like that's going to be the case. I'm not going to write Buddy Johnson off already. He's a young guy. He's got a lot to learn. He has shown flashes. Overall, though, haven't heard a lot from him in terms of what he's done in training camp. And then I wasn't overly pleased with his first appearance in the preseason this year. And I think he's going to be one of those guys too. I just don't know what his niche is going to be. I don't know if he's going to be a guy that can cover really well or come downhill really well like Vince Williams. He's just kind of there. And I want to see a lot more from him going into the next game. All right, let's talk about James Daniels. A guy I was high on. This is one of my favorite offseason signings. But I'm going to put him in the stock trending down. And he just had a couple reps that scared me a little bit in his first preseason game. I'm not worried about him. I think we've seen 4 years of pretty quality play from James Daniels on a pretty bad football team. And so what are your thoughts on Daniels in his first game?
Yeah, I was definitely a little disappointed just because I was hoping for better from him to start off. It is a preseason game for a player who is a veteran. He isn't a guy that like you have to worry about trying to make the team. So him not playing super well in the first preseason game isn't alarming or anything. But he was on the ground a few too many times for my liking, especially. Made that mistake with diagnosing who was coming on the rush and got Trubisky
Yep.
hit. Like it to me, like I would have loved a better debut for him for sure. But until I see it a couple times, I'm not gonna sit here and say, "Oh, well, he's a bust of a of signing." Like that's way too early to say.
Yeah, we're not going to go hitting the panic button on James
No,
Daniels anytime soon. Although I will say that it looks like from all the reports that I've seen, been a little bit up and down at preseason. Hasn't been particularly like a standout in like the O
right?
line versus D line drills. I don't think that is necessarily where his forte is, though. Either he's not a power guy, he's more of
No,
a athlete and technique and finesse guy. And so
yes,
I think once we get into the regulars, I think there's still a good chance that when we look back on the 2022 season, we could say, yeah, James Daniels was probably the best offensive lineman of the group. I still think that's certainly possible.
oh yeah,
I would
for
be
sure.
kind of surprised if he ended up being the weak link of this bunch,
Yeah,
wouldn't you?
that I'd be surprised. Anything if he's the third or better lineman that we had this year, that's going to be what I would expect, if not more than that. Anything worse than that, and I'd definitely be surprised.
Yeah, so we're going to take that one with a grain of salt. All right, what about Delonte Scott, Steelers backup edge defender? Got the nod to play with the first team defense, or what was left of it at least. We're missing a
Yeah,
bunch of guys on defense.
right. Yeah.
But I mean, this is a guy who had a pretty strong camp by pretty much everybody's remarks. But he comes into this preseason game, he's getting pushed up the arc. He's getting completely washed out in the run. Is there anything that Delonte Scott can do now to save himself on this roster and say, yeah, I can beat out Jannard Avery or Derek Tuska for one of those final spots?
I mean, the only thing that's going to help him at this point is just the lack of depth at edge and just deciding how many guys
Mhm.
we keep. Like, Tusco looked overall pretty decent compared to the rest of the group as a pass rusher, especially. So his spot's probably secure. Avery, when he's healthy, he's going to make the team. He's the best. He's the third best edge
Mhm.
rusher for sure right now on the team. So those two guys are very safe. Scott, just like you say, didn't do anything to sit there and say, yeah, he can play snaps for this team if you need him to. He didn't show anything that would suggest that. And against the Seahawks offensive line, that definitely is not known for being very good, obviously, for a long time. Part of why they no longer have their quarterback there. But he just didn't show enough for me to say, yeah, that's the guy who I could see getting some third down snaps occasionally. Maybe Highsmith needs to come off and whatever else. But he's going to have to hope that either he really shows out the rest of camp and sticks around long enough to do that, or that the injuries continue to be there at edge.
Yeah, and prior to that game, I would have said Delonte Scott's a guy we can have a conversation about, right? This is a guy
Yeah.
that we can at least put in that Derek Tuska mix of players who could potentially be that fourth edge on the team. And I think after that performance, I mean, we just saw like a sheer lack of NFL power. And
Hmm.
so he would really, really, I think, have to step things up a lot in these next two performances to jump back into that conversation. And so I think if we were to do a roster prediction right now, we would both pretty safely have him on the outside looking
Yeah.
in.
Right now. Yeah.
All right, let's talk about one more name that we have in the stock trending down, and that was Carlos Davis. This is a guy that I wanted to give a second chance to. He suffered the injury last year, didn't get to play much. Athletic guy coming out. Obviously, his twin brother Khalil is on the team fighting for the same position, which is, I'm sure, a complete rarity. But
Yeah.
the chances of either one of these guys making the roster at this point is probably slim to none. We'd have to look at an injury to an interior defender for that probably to happen. And Carlos Davis, I don't think helped this case in his first preseason game.
No, his brother's the one who made the play that that Mike Tomlin really
Yes.
smiled about at the end of the game. So, yeah, it's just hard. Like even if he played great, I just don't know if there's room for really either of the brothers or some of the other guys down the roster. Like it's just so hard to crack that rotation at this point of who we expect to be there. That again, it's going to take an injury or them deciding to keep way too many defensive linemen. Maybe they're scared from last year, but I don't think it's going to be enough guys, obviously, for them to really be in serious consideration. They're really playing for trying to make a team somewhere else or trying to get on a squad if they can, somewhere practice squad, that type of thing.
Yeah, and unfortunately for Carlos, I think that he's missed his window, and it happened last year
Yeah,
when the defensive line was depleted. Unfortunately,
exactly.
he was injured
He was
at the
part of
same
that. Yeah.
time. Yeah, and so he didn't get that opportunity to prove himself when the opportunities would have been available. And this year, they're just not going to be. And so I
Yeah.
feel for him there, but not the strongest performance from him. All right. If you're a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Still Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate your support. Okay, Shane, we're going to talk about the upcoming preseason game against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I want to talk about next week. I plan to do a roster prediction. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. We'll see if we can dwindle down our 53. But for today, I want to talk about the biggest positions to watch in terms of implications, not only for the roster, but potentially for a starting gig as well.
Mm-hmm.
But let's start with the running back position. A lot riding on this game, I feel like. And I know that these coaches, they see these players all the time in camp. And so the camp practices are probably every bit as impactful as what the preseason games are. But we didn't see Benny Snell in week 1. The guy was nursing an injury, just recently came back to practice. What we did see was McFarland and Warren really take off in his absence. And so now I think I think you could almost describe it as a 3-way race for that RB2 spot behind Najee Harris right now. And I know that Warren's the undrafted guy. He had a couple fumbles throughout camp, and he's got to work on his ball security. But I think it's pretty fair to say that these guys are at the very least in the same tier. And so I think what happens this Saturday against the Jaguars is going to be important, don't you think?
Absolutely. Benny Snell especially, and this is someone I've been on record talking about before. You can ask anybody who I talk, sports with a lot in general. I just don't view him as a true NFL caliber running back at this point. I really don't. And that's nothing against Benny Snell. I think he's a great guy from everything I've heard. It just, when you watch him play, you can tell he doesn't have the athleticism you want from the position. He doesn't really run with as much power as you'd want for a guy who that's his game. That's what he was known for coming out of Kentucky. And if McFarland is healthy and able to at least break some tackles and to show the speed, show the stuff that makes him good, and Warren can deal with the fumbles and not have that be a major issue, those two are more talented than him. They just are. And, maybe they're more comfortable with Snell because he's been there, he's gotten the chance to play, and he's done enough for them to not just keep him off the roster. But he really should be looking behind him right now and saying, oh, those two guys are probably more talented than me. I really have to show something. And if he can do that, then obviously he'll probably have the leg up because he has been the number 2 back so far. But in my money, I'd rather have a combo of McFarland and Warren behind Najee, and that's just kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah, I agree with you as well. And I don't know if it's that the Steelers had nothing else, and so it was Benny Snell football, or Mike Tomlin really likes Benny Snell football. I don't know how you get on that bandwagon. Like, I was never there to begin with. Like, in coming out of Kentucky, like, I know Snell was a young guy. He fit the profile, 5'10 plus, 220 plus, a guy that can run between the tackles, but he wasn't overly efficient at doing that. He did carry his team a little bit, but I sometimes I feel like combine numbers are important.
They are. They can be.
Not in every case, but in this case, I feel like you are spending a 4th round pick, a quality mid-round selection on a running back that's pushing 4.7 speed in his youth. And without suffering an injury, this is a slow, plodding running back. And we have seen nothing over the past 3 years to suggest us that he's been any different from that guy. He's not taken a step forward. If anything, he's taken a step backwards, averaged 2.7 yards a carry. If you look at Football Outsiders, in terms of efficiency, he is near the bottom of the list among every single qualifying running back in the NFL in terms of efficiency numbers last year, DVOA and otherwise. And so just not great. The results have not been great. I think what is saving Snell right now is this is a guy that plugged in over 300 special team snaps for the Steelers last season alone. Now it'll be up to them to decide, can we replace that special teams value with another player? And if the answer is yes, then Snell needs to be gone. There's just no way that you can justify keeping him on the roster when he's not good as a running back. And McFarland and Warren could potentially be with that opportunity, with the same opportunity that Snell has had. And so not crazy about what we've been seeing from Snell. He missed that first game, but man, does he need to have a big game, I think, in this second showing, because in these last couple practices, at least in today's practice, I don't remember if Snell had been practicing for the last 2 days or not, if he just came back, but Warren has been running ahead of him in practice, and that's something that the coaching staff is obviously intrigued by now, is getting him a little bit more involved. And so definitely interested to see how that race unfolds. Big implications at the running back position against Jacksonville this week. All right, let's look at the wide receiver position. Sadly, Anthony Miller is out of the race with landing on IR with a shoulder injury. But we do have Gunnar Olszewski. We do have Miles Boykin. This is a team that last year they kept just 5 receivers on the roster. If the Steelers keep Olszewski and Boykin, that's 6 guys. And that's counting Calvin Austin as well, assuming that he doesn't begin the season on PUP or anything like that. And so do you think that the Steelers, first of all, are willing to devote an additional roster spot to the wide receiver position this year? And I also want to say, after you answer that, hypothetically, if they do not, which of these 2 guys makes the roster?
Good question. So definitely, as far as whether I think they could keep a 6th spot, I really do, because the competition is there. Like, the guys have shown that they deserve the spots and that they're fighting for them. And I think that if you have 6 guys who are all worthy of a spot, you might as well give them to them, especially if one of them is Miles Boykin, who I think could, in the event that you want to move on from Snell, he could be that special teams replacement, because he's a great special teams player. Always has been since he's been at the Ravens. Also really good blocker for the offense if you need to have him in for that. He can do things that I think are just as valuable, if not more valuable, than what Snell's brought special teams wise. So I think if you keep 6, those 2, Olszewski to being a returner and occasional offensive guy, Boykin kind of the same way, they could bring more value than having like a 4th running back or, whatever else they might keep instead. If they only keep 5, I like Boykin a lot, because I think he has some potential still as a receiver, at least as like a downfield threat and as a good blocker on the outside. But Olszewski looked pretty good in the preseason game as a receiver too. I think he has some maybe untapped potential there. He does have very good quickness, obviously, from that returning background. Smart player. Seemed like he catches the ball pretty well in that game, especially. I do think that they're going to keep both of them, but if I had to keep one, I'm probably leaning toward Boykin, especially if one of the other guys can handle return duties.
Okay. I'm going to disagree with you just a little bit on this. I agree with the fact. I think that they will devote that 6th spot to receiver this year, something that they did not do last year, and they didn't have the depth for it last year either. So I think that they do keep both when it's all said and done. However, if I were making that choice, and I think it's the one the Steelers would probably make as well.
Probably.
I think they would keep Gunnar Olszewski, former All-Pro return man, led the NFL in return yards and return average in punt return average last season. A guy that can give you a lot of special team snaps in a variety of ways, and a guy that the other thing is contractually too. So the Steelers signed Olszewski for a 2-year contract, devoted a little over $4.2 million with them. So the financial investment's a little bit higher there as well. I agree that Boykin, he offers a lot as a gunner. His special teams ability is very good in that regard as well. Again, if that's a guy that I can keep instead of Benny Snell, I'm doing that
for sure.
Because he offers more there, and he's more valuable coming in even just as a reserve wide receiver than Snell is coming in to take up snaps and get 2 yards of carry as a running back. And so I agree, though, that I think that they will keep both. I think they'll find a way to make that 6th receiver work this year. And when we're looking at these guys, number 5, number 6 on the roster, we aren't looking at guys that are going to carve out a big role in offense. These are going to be more of your Darius Hayward-Bay types, the guys that are towards the bottom of the roster. They have to have that niche on special teams. They got to carve out their role there, because there's no sense of putting like a Miles Boykin in the game, for example, when you can have George Pickens in the game or Chase Claypool in the game. There's just better options ahead of them. But I agree. I think both of these guys end up making the roster. It'll be interesting to see what they do this week against Jacksonville. I think that they're both relatively safe at this point, but I don't think that would have been the case had Miller not suffered that injury. Then I think that
could have made it interesting for sure.
Yeah, he certainly would have. I think they would both had to work a little bit harder, especially probably Boykin would have had to work a little bit harder as well, because they're probably only keeping one guy for special teams of those bottom 3 guys there. And so that would have made that race interesting. I know a lot of people liked what they saw from Steven Sims in the first game. He did have the huge end around carry. He had a nice punt return. Offensively, he didn't do much. I just feel like Steven Sims is a guy that's, unless he really can take that punt return job away from Olszewski, he doesn't have that niche on special teams, and he's not a guy that's valuable enough to keep simply for his offensive ability. And so I think that that's a guy, even with a strong preseason, these next 2 games, I think that he's still outside of that roster bubble, and maybe he plays well enough to give himself a chance somewhere else after waivers. So we'll see how he performs. Okay, we talked about the offensive guards a little bit already. Let's return to that here. Kendrick Green played in the first game against Seattle. Kevin Dotson did not, nursing an ankle injury. Last year, he missed half the season with a high ankle sprain. So these ankles come a little bit worrisome with him these days, carrying all that massive barrel-chested upper body. But what do you envision happening this game, and what do you want to see happen with these 2 guys against the Jaguars?
I definitely want to see Dotson, if he's healthy, out there with the first team. He's the better player. I know that they want to try to make Green work. I know that's why they're kind of pushing this as like a battle, because Dotson's dealing with injuries. He hasn't been reliable. Green has been unreliable just being on the field in general. So you have 2 guys who have their issues, but for different reasons. I think Dotson is definitely by far the better player when he actually plays. That's not really a question for me. It's just, can he get out there? Does he look healthy? Does he look good? Assuming he's ready to go, he's the starting guard. There's no way that Green's going to beat him out at this point. Things would have to completely flip on their head. And as much as that'd be great, the better offensive line you have, the better. I don't obviously see that happening. So I think it's his job to lose pretty easily at this point.
Yeah, I agree with you as well. I mean, again, assuming that Dotson is healthy enough and ready to go, I'd love to see him get the nod with the starters, plugging him in. He needs that chemistry. He's missed some practice time, and he's missed half the season, like we said last year. And so I don't think there's a question I put out a poll today. Last I saw on Twitter, it had close to 200 votes, and 98% of people thought that Kevin Dotson is a currently better player than Kendrick Green, and that would be my vote as well. What we've seen from Dotson in his first 2 seasons, I don't think he's done really anything to disappoint. From expectations, at least, he might not be a Pro Bowl level guy, but we're talking about a guy that if he does give up a bad play, doesn't make a mistake, it's typically a mental thing. It's not because he's physically overpowered. I mean, this is a guy that carries his weight very, very well at 6'4", 321. And unfortunately, and I know people like to say, they like to toss it off to the side and say it doesn't matter. But man, when Kendrick Green is 6'1" and 7/8 and in a shade over 300 pounds with short arms, it does matter. It does matter when you're playing a position like this. You're just going to be smaller than all the guys you're going up against. And that kind of is a recipe for disaster. So we want to see Dotson get healthy. We want to see him win this job out. And I'll ask you, Shane, what happens? We get through these next 2 games. Let's assume both of these guys play and they don't get injured, but they both look bad. Like, do you think the Steelers would go the route of saying, hey, we need another guy, and go out and sign a guy like Eric Flowers, who's sitting there in free agency? That obviously they'd have to move some cap space around. They can restructure Watt if need be. But would you be up for that decision if both of these guys look bad over the next 2 preseason games?
I would definitely not just completely not even consider the idea of bringing someone else in. Like, I think it's something you have to think about if they're really bad enough that you're looking at each other going, I don't know if we can go into the season with either of these guys starting. I don't expect that, obviously, with Dotson minus an injury happening. If Green's your only option, then maybe you definitely do that. I think that bringing really any guy who has some experience, or maybe even making a minor trade for a guy that's maybe not going to get a chance to start on another team, but could be a starter for you, or even John LeGlue. Like, he's a guy that, again, we've talked about, has played better than Green to this point. Maybe he gets the nod if there is an injury to Dotson, but I don't expect the Steelers to do that. I think that they will roll with whoever they have, minus it being too many injuries to deal with or something like that. But I wouldn't be opposed to it if it comes down to it.
Yeah, I mean, you've gone this far. You've signed Mason Cole. You signed James Daniels. You don't want to have a glaring weak link in that offensive line. And I agree with you. If Dotson is healthy, the Dotson we saw as a rookie, that guy was a mauler. And he had, according to Pro Football Focus, he had the best pass blocking grade of any of those interior guys.
Super stout.
Yeah, and that was impressive. And it wasn't just a game or 2. This guy got in like five games of action where he played like starter snaps. And so
exactly.
It was a significant chunk there, and we just didn't see him very healthy last season. And so I hope he gets completely healthy and no more setbacks with these ankles. And I'd like to see what he can do if he is, because I think he could kind of return to form and be that guy that we can at least have one player in that offensive line that's that physical mauling type presence there. And so I'm excited to watch him this week, assuming that he's healthy and ready to go. All right, let's look at the interior defensive line. If not wide receiver, I think this is the biggest question mark throughout camp is who are going to be the guys at the bottom of this roster. Do the Steelers break historic trend by keeping a 7th interior defensive lineman? And I will just say again that I went back and I looked at the depth chart history in the archives for ourlad.com. And it has been exactly 10 years since the last time the Steelers decided to roster that 7th interior defender for a season. Do they break that trend again this year for the first time in a decade to keep both Montravius Adams and Isaiah Loudermilk for that final spot on the team? Do both of those guys make it?
I would really like to see that, because I think they both offer you very different things. Adams is a great athlete on the interior. He has more pass rushing ability as it stands. He's the guy that knifes in, makes those quick plays. Loudermilk is a true Steelers defensive lineman in every way possible. He's the size, the attitude, the toughness in the run game, and I think he is improving as a pass rusher. I think it's going to probably never be great. It's never going to be something that you know him for, but he can be good enough where you don't have to only put him out there on like first and second down run situations. Both of these guys are guys that I think would get swiped up by any team on the waiver wire for sure. Especially, honestly, Loudermilk, because he fills a specific niche that a lot of teams could use in run defense. I would much rather not expose either of these guys. We already lost Quincy Roche last year is a guy that I would like to keep. Don't want to have the same thing happen again where a talented defender ends up getting sniped. So I'd much rather see them both make it.
Yeah, and it's hard to say, because like when you're going against a historic trend like this, do I say that the first time are they willing to do it this year? But I think that this could be the year that they finally revert back to that for the first time in a decade, just simply because this is where the strength of your team is. It is on the interior defensive line. This is where your depth is. I'd much rather you go that route than keeping somebody that is far less deserving of a roster spot at a different position. I agree with you. I think that if you do cut Loudermilk, you're not stashing this guy back on the practice squad. He's a second-year guy. The Steelers traded a 4th-round pick to get back into the 2021 draft to select him, and it's a guy that has gotten bigger, more muscular, and I think a little bit better throughout camp. And so you don't see the guys very often either that are 6'6", roughly 320-ish, and guys that can two-gap, that can hold up at the point of attack and stop the run. And so he does hold a lot of value there. Very different. Him and Montravius Adams are very different football players, but I think both of them are deserving a roster spot. Yeah. I want to see them both make it. Is there anything that can happen, barring an injury, in this game against Jacksonville to make the Steelers think otherwise and say, okay, maybe one of these guys, maybe we'll only keep 6?
I think it would have to be a situation where they really, really hate the depth somewhere else, or an injury, like you said, happens at a spot where they have to bring someone else in who's going to make the roster. Like there's no chance they don't. Whether that be maybe at a position like corner, or, if a receiver gets hurt and they want to keep 6, they don't have 6 they like, something like that would have to happen, I think, for them to not even consider keeping them both, because they are the two guys that are on the technical roster bubble because of the 6 versus 7 keeping them. But I think they're both very, like we said, worthy of making the team, and I'd rather not lose guys like that over keeping a corner that isn't going to play, right, or a corner that you don't want to see out on the field, something like that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that as well. And we saw what happened just last year. Like this team got depleted on the interior defensive line, and they struggled mightily as a result. Dead last in the league in rushing yards allowed, dead last in the league in yards allowed per attempt, 5.0, which is kind of humiliating for this Steelers defense, a defense that previously finished in the top 6 in 4 consecutive years. And so we do not want to go down that road again. I think, especially if we're looking at just the ability, run stopping ability. This is why you draft a guy like Loudermilk in the first place. You want him to be that jumbo 5 technique, can slide in at 1 technique in nickel situations, a guy that can really be stout against the run. And I don't expect him to have a big role, but this is a guy that can kind of carve out his niche with the team. They can go through a healthy rotation, a 2 or 3 deep rotation on the defensive line, where they're getting all these guys involved, keeping them all fresh in an attempt to avoid these injuries. And I think you're trying to look at it like we've got to replace one Stephon Tuitt. None of these guys can do it by
No.
themselves. But maybe if you have Loudermilk's run stopping ability and Ogunjobi and Leal's pass rushing ability, maybe those guys collectively, you play them at the right time, that can replace a Tuitt. And I think that's the hope. That's what I'm hoping that they're looking at right now. I would be really disappointed if they had to get rid of one. I know Adams only spent 5 games on the Steelers roster last year, but he looked pretty good. And I think that if they cut him, he's probably going to be the best player that the Steelers cut this year. And so I don't love that happening either. Backup nose tackle, like I said, different roles, but defensive line is deep. I can't say the same for every other position. It's like defensive line, wide receiver. There's a couple, and there are some that are really, really thin. Let's talk about another one that's really thin. This will be the last one that we discuss today. Let's talk about the cornerback position. I don't mind what the Steelers have going for them up front. I think it could be better. And I think if we look at it in terms of other rosters around the league, it's still below average in my mind. When you're looking at Ahkello Witherspoon, Levi Wallace, and Cam Sutton as your top 3 cornerbacks. After that, it gets a little bit dicey. We've got Arthur Maulet's been running with the first team. He's really the only other guy I think the team really trusts to be like that nickel defender. So if something were to happen to Cam Sutton, and Arthur Maulet is an experienced guy. He's in his late 20s. He played a lot with the Jets even back then. And so he's got that experience. I think they feel comfortable keeping him on the roster, sliding him into that role. Not a particularly great coverage guy, but a guy that knows what he's doing and can come downhill and support the run. A little bit like a very poor man's like Mike Hilton type. And
exactly.
So I think that's a guy that's going to stick around. The next 2, though, is where it gets a little bit tricky. James Pierre, Justin Lane. These are 2 guys that battled each other last year. Both had their moments in preseason and training camp. And same with this year a little bit, although I would definitely give the edge to Pierre. How do you see this battle going out? Is there any room for both of them on the roster, or is it one or the other?
My concern is you're looking at 2 guys who are about as different as possible. You have Justin Lane, who's the athlete. It's why he was drafted as high as he was. He's a great athlete at corner. No technique to speak of. Just cannot cover consistently despite his athletic gifts. And then you have James Pierre, who in general is a very good technician, knows how to cover guys, but just doesn't have the athleticism to stay with some really talented receivers that he's going to face. And you don't really feel great about a lot of players that might be on him or that you would want him to guard, except for some bigger receivers who don't have as much juice. And we saw what happened like with Jamar Chase last year when he had to cover him on the deep ball. Like, it just isn't there. But he at least brings you, like, he's able to cover players as long as you give him the right matchups. Whereas Lane, I don't trust him in really many matchups at all. So Pierre is the better corner as it stands right now. It's just, can you live with the lack of athleticism? And then Lane gives you the athleticism, but do you trust him to cover anybody? That's kind of your issue right now.
Yeah, I totally agree with your assessment there. And Lane was a guy I was pretty high on coming out of college just because you don't see guys like that very often. Over 6'2", long wingspan, great athlete. I mean, this guy, and he was a young player coming out, former wide receiver convert, but therein lies part of the problem. I would probably think as well. It's such a developmental prospect. And you don't see many of these success stories. Ahkello Witherspoon was one of them, though. He was one of those guys that had to work his way up the ladder, was basically just a tools-based prospect coming out. And I think he's performed well over the past 2 years now, but it took him a long time to get to that point. Already a 27-year-old player, so it wasn't great in his first several years. But it started coming along strong with the 49ers in 2020. And then at the end of the season with the Steelers in 2021, even at the first 3 quarters of the season, Witherspoon did essentially nothing. The Steelers couldn't find his way on the field. And so when you're working with tools guys that are those developmental prospects, it's so hard. But at some point, I feel like you just have to bite the bullet, and you got to give up on Justin Lane. Like year 4 now, what does he have to offer? And if he hasn't shown enough improvement, enough strides over that time, I worry that he's just one of those guys that's just not going to get it. At the same time, not thrilled about James Pierre either. I think this is a guy, if you're only asked to cover 10 to 15 yards down the field, I think he could be excellent. But you get past that, and we saw him just get torched down the field a few times last year. And there is no – when you got 4.6 speed as a corner, which is essentially what James Pierre had, 4.59, I believe, at his pro day, you're just not going to be able to have the speed to make up to cover NFL receivers down the field. And so both a little bit worrisome in their own ways. Honestly, I really think that this is just a position that the Steelers need to invest in at some point in the future. I think Pierre and Lane on their very best day, they should be a bottom of the roster corner and one that you probably don't really want seeing the field. And so if fans are looking at it from the perspective like, yeah, let's let these guys battle it out. One of them is going to be the future for us. I would not think that way at all.
No.
I think we've seen enough of them. And I just don't think that they've got what it takes to be that top flight corner, even a starting caliber corner that you look for in the NFL. So I'm really hoping that their top 3 guys stay healthy and that we don't have to see a situation where one of these guys is getting played too many snaps. But be interesting to see how that turns out. I think that Pierre's on the inside of the bubble right now. My prediction, I think that Lane is on the outside. And so I think it would take a pretty incredible 2-game stretch from Lane to maybe change the mind of the Steelers and some strong practices at the end of training camp here to have them thinking the other way. All right, Shane, we're going to wrap things up. Thank you for joining the podcast today, Shane.
Absolutely.
You can follow him on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Still Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, check us out on YouTube. And thanks for listening to the Still Curtain podcast.